Good afternoon. If any of the sisters here have not yet met with Elder Parminder and myself, or been placed down for a worship service, can you please approach me as soon as this presentation is finished? And we'll make sure that that happens, in case anyone has been missed in that process. We've been looking at the subject of the counterfeit. We've moved on from our discussion of the Nethinims, or the world, to looking at the history of modern Babylon, and we constructed the counterfeit of modern Israel, finding it beginning in 1899, then tracing it through the First and the Second World War, through 1950, 1962, and then the late 1980s. So it's pretty much the alpha history of modern Babylon with the intermediate period. We haven't yet considered what the omega history of modern Babylon would look like. So can someone explain to me the meaning of a counterfeit? My sister. What's the meaning of a counterfeit? Sorry? You explain it how you would want to. Sorry? The opposite of something original. So if I had a phone and you wanted to counterfeit it, would you build a water bottle? If I had a phone and you wanted to build a counterfeit of my phone, would you construct a water bottle? Why? Because they don't resemble. So what properties does a counterfeit have to have? What's the properties of a counterfeit? Sorry? It must be the same? So if I have a phone and you want to counterfeit it, you're going to build another one of these. Is it exactly the same? No, but it has to resemble the same. Close but not exact. So in your first statement, you said a counterfeit is the opposite of something. Would you still say that? Almost the same, so they're not opposites. So a counterfeit of something must resemble it as closely as possible, but can it be of the same quality as the original? Can it be of the same value? No. If we were to go to a dictionary definition, if we were to turn to Webster's 1828 dictionary, it describes a counterfeit. A counterfeit means to forge, to copy or imitate, without authority or right to do so, with a view to deceive or defraud, by passing the copy or thing forged for that which is original or genuine. Did everyone get that? Sister Snyder, did you get that? A counterfeit means to forge, to copy or imitate, without authority or right, with a view to deceive or defraud, by passing the copy or thing forged for that which is original or genuine. So apply that to what we're understanding with modern Babylon. So to copy or imitate. So there's original. The original is Israel. And Satan is going to copy or imitate modern Israel or Israel. Does he have the authority or right to do that? With a view to deceive or defraud. What does it mean to defraud? What does it mean to defraud? If you were to defraud me, what would you be doing? Assist. If you were to defraud me, what would you be doing? So you're going to take something from me. Does anyone else want to define defraud? Brother Willie.
I think this when I take something from you, not in a right, illegally, when I illegally take something from you, especially money.
To take something illegally. So you have no right to it. And what tactics are you going to use? Deception?
Yeah.
Defraud. Obtain something by deception, taking something wrongfully without the knowledge or the consent of the owner. To cheat. Apply that to the counterfeit. What are we saying when we talk about the counterfeit?
I think it imitates, it's going to imitate something that God or Christ has done in a rightful way.
So a counterfeit is going to imitate
Something that Christ or God has done
something, imitate something that Christ or God has done
in a wrong way.
in a wrong way. What do you mean by in a wrong way?
Illegal.
Illegally.
Yeah, without permit from Christ.
No permission.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to add anything else to the definition of a counterfeit? Sister Snyder? Deceive? So it's, how would you put that? Its purpose? Why would you want to deceive? If I wanted to counterfeit something to deceive you, why would I do that? What am I hoping you will do? Because I'd be deceiving you with a purpose. Brother Dennis. Take your attention from the original. So, I'm looking at the true, and you want to draw my attention away from something true to something counterfeit? Do you have your... brother at the back was first. Duplicate? Yes, it's a good word. Sorry? I didn't catch that. Forgery. Imitate. I'll put that here. That starts making us think of art, doesn't it? Is a forgery ever of the same value? Brother Willie.
So, it is wanted to say, I think the purpose or the purpose of deceiving is you may want to confuse somebody on your side. So we have the truth and we have something wrong. I want to by imitating, I want you to be confused so that you can fall on my side.
So, my brother has something that's true, something valuable, it's worth something, and I'll use me. I'm going to create a forgery of that because I want you to either give your money to me or draw your attention to me and cause you to give your time or your energy or your money to something that is actually not true or not valuable. It's a method of stealing. Anyone want to add to that? No one wants to add to that definition of my brother.
So I think before I go to the reason of the counterfeiter, you have to say that counterfeit is fake or forgery, more than the same in those conditions. Then the reason behind the counterfeiter is to attract or draw attention from the real one now, so that for his interest, so that you lose focus on the real thing. And now you will be either you will be lost or you will gain you.
So, there's a painting Do we all know the Mona Lisa? Famous, extremely valuable painting. We all know the Mona Lisa. If I wanted to counterfeit the Mona Lisa, I would create what the word one brother gave us was forgery. I create a forgery or a counterfeit Mona Lisa. I go into the museum, I steal this painting, and I replace it with a forgery. Why would I do that? Sister Fiona.
There are same reasons they have given, but I can also add that it could be for tarnishing the name of the original producer.
To tarnish the name of the original producer. I like that. That's a good point. It can also be done to tarnish or damage the reputation of the original creator. If I did this, if I went into the museum secretly, covertly, replaced an expensive painting with a replica that is worthless, am I doing that to attract people's attention to the forgery? No. I'm just asking that because a lot of people gave the definition that it's to attract people to the forgery. Assist.
I'm trying to think if the owner of the original thing gains some benefit from it or has an advantage when he possesses that thing. So when I create the counterfeit, maybe I'll gain the same advantage by deceiving people with this counterfeit.
So whoever painted this became very wealthy, and if I counterfeit it, I think I can steal some of that wealth. So if someone makes a bag that is very expensive to buy, I might make ones that are of much cheaper material, ones that are worthless or worth a lot less, and sell them for higher prices because I'm passing them off as being the one of value. That's your point. So it's to get gain through deception and different ways of doing that. Does anyone have anything else to add? My brother.
Can I say that the purpose of counterfeit is to keep people in a state of ignorance so that I can obtain some favor or there's some hidden agenda that I want to achieve.
To keep people in a state of ignorance. How would you apply that to this?
So if I come with something that resembles really Mona Lisa, a person who is not informed, he will think that I've created is the original, but the one who is conversant or knows the genuine, he will identify this is fake. But a person who is not informed will be easily deceived.
So to understand a forgery from a true, which one do you need to study? If we can raise our hands. Which one do we need to study? My brother. So you need to study the true to understand the forgery. Then how do you know it's a forgery? My brother first. If you're studying this true one and not studying this one, how do you know it's a forgery?
It doesn't closely resemble.
But you don't know that, because you're not studying the counterfeit. If I have two phones, one phone, and I counterfeit this phone, and it looks essentially almost identical, if I only study the true one, I'll never pick up on the defects. Someone raise their hands. You first.
Okay. In order for me to identify the fake one, I must have an experience with the genuine one, so that I can identify both of which is the genuine, which is fake. But the first thing I have to have experience of the genuine, so that when I use this, when I come across this fake one, I will know the features of the original one and look at this, and then I'll be able to differentiate between the two.
So you need to understand the true one first. So what you're saying is order of study, not studying one over the other. Placing more importance on studying one than the other. Just order. I saw a hand. Brother Dennis, I saw your hand.
I was trying to say, to me, I would study both.
Study both?
Yes, and compare them and contrast. And if I have a good knowledge of what is the truth, by comparing and contrasting the similarities and the difference, I can get to know what is the original and what is the fake one.
So I'll repeat for the camera. Brother Dennis says he would study both because you need to... I think I mind blank already.
So I need to study both.
Study both.
Yes, for me to understand, and then I compare the two.
So you use the words compare and contrast.
Yes.
So unless you have an intimate working knowledge of both, you cannot compare and contrast the two. That's your point.
Yeah.
If you only have a working knowledge of one, you cannot create any compare and contrast. Does anyone else have anything to add on that subject? How to identify a counterfeit or a forgery? So when we come to looking at, if I had any understanding of art, I would take the Mona Lisa and I would put it under good lights and understand that whoever painted it, painted using a particular stroking motion. And then you would take the counterfeit and you would put it under the same lights and see whether or not it's painted by the same hand. Does the painter use the same techniques of striking the canvas? So you're going to actually study both paintings equally. And then you're going to compare and contrast the makeup of one with the makeup of the second. Does that make sense? Because we have this nice story about how to identify a counterfeit. You only need to have an intimate working knowledge of the true. And I don't think that's real life. If you want to understand the counterfeit and place it as a counterfeit, you also need to have some intimate working knowledge of that counterfeit. You need to know how it was constructed, what made it up, what materials were used. You need to date the materials of used. If you have a clay pot from 2,000 years ago and you want to know if somebody has counterfeited that clay pot, you're going to take the counterfeit and you're going to study its makeup. You're going to use dating methods to see how old it is. How old is the clay? Has any modern techniques been used? So you're going to study the counterfeit. To do that, you do need a working knowledge of the true. Does that make sense? And Brother Dennis made a good point. You can't compare and contrast unless you have a working knowledge of both. Do we have anyone have a different view on that or anything to add? So, when we come to our definition of a counterfeit, it means, I will just read through this definition again, people have summarized it nicely. It means to deprive of someone's right by taking something by deception or artifice. So when we look at, in this context, who is depriving who? Someone deprives someone else of their rights. In this context, who is that? Counterfeit? The counterfeiter? Who's the counterfeiter?
The one who has created the imitation.
The one who's created the imitation? I'm looking for application. Who has counterfeited? Satan. So the counterfeiter deprives the creator of the original of their rights or property. So Satan is counterfeiting to deprive who of their rights and property? God. So Satan is going to counterfeit something. He's going to counterfeit the work of God to deprive God of his rights and property. What is God's rights and property? Because you expect some type of gain. If I'm going to counterfeit something valuable, I'm trying to take the earnings of the creator of the original from them and steal it to myself. So if you created something that was of high value and I was to counterfeit that, what I'm trying to do is divert the recognition or the fame or the money that would have gone to you, rightfully to you, and divert it to myself. So what does Satan hope to gain that rightfully belongs to God? Brother Rogers. Man? So people. Do you want to add anything to that? Or? To gain subjects. Because we have two kingdoms and they're fighting over subjects. Oh, brother.
They would gain homage from man instead of man giving homage to God or worship.
So to gain homage from man. Anyone else? So Satan is going to deprive God of his rights and of his property by obtaining them through deception or artifice, by taking something wrongfully. Here it says without the knowledge, but we know God knows all, but without the consent of the owner, without the consent of God. It's to cheat, to defraud, to prevent one from obtaining what he could justly claim. So when we're looking at the counterfeit, it must be an imitation or a forgery. And if I'm going to counterfeit a note, a piece of money, You're creating a piece of money, it's real, it has value. I'm going to counterfeit that. Day one, how good am I? Not very good. But I practice and I practice and I practice, and what starts happening to the counterfeit? It starts to look in appearance closer and closer to the true. Can it ever have the same value as the true? No. Can they ever be completely identical? No. They cannot have those qualities. But through practice, I can get it to where it is as close as humanly possible. Does that make sense? So over 6,000 years, you start to see Satan counterfeiting. At the beginning, how does he do? I'm not going to do an in-depth study of that, I just want to touch on it. If you go back to the very beginning and you start comparing and contrasting Israel and Babylon, you can see the comparison, but how good is it? It's not actually that good. It's riddled with mistakes. You come into the history of the early church and the papacy, and how is the counterfeit? 500 years apart. Still not that good. You come down to the end of the world, and how is the counterfeit? It's becoming more and more like the true. I don't really want to go in to prove that. I just want us to think about it. So Satan works through counterfeiting the work of God. This is to imitate the work of God, as God deals with both his own people and the world. Satan counterfeits that with how he deals with his own people and the world. He does not have permission to do this, and the purpose is for deception, to take what rightfully belongs to God to himself. And to understand the counterfeit from the true, we need to have a working knowledge of both. Are we all okay with that? Okay. So we did that particularly from this history. We looked at modern Israel and modern Babylon. We compared and contrasted the time period from coming out of captivity in 1798, and there's a raising up of a messenger, and there's the giving of the three angels' messages. We compare and contrast that with 1899, the raising up of a messenger, the giving of the three angels' messages. Is the counterfeit exactly like the true? No. When does Ellen White begin to have visions? When does Lucia have visions? They're not identical. 1798 is not 100 years from 1899, is it? 1818 is not 100 years from 1917, or 1844 from 1945. The counterfeit is never accurate, completely accurate. Can we see that? But it's still coming in as close as possible. From 1899, 1798, 1818, 1917. 1833 lines neatly up with 1933. This is when Miller has the authority to share his message. This is when Pacelli has the authority to enact code of canon law. This is the disappointment and failure, disappointment and failure. When it comes to this one, how did the counterfeit do? Really well, down to the day 100 years apart. November 1, 1850, November 1, 1950. Trying to use the messages of this history to finish the work, trying to use the messages of this history to finish the work. Both found their churches in a Laodicean condition. It doesn't happen. 1863, organisation, a good work, but a rejection of the prophetic message and a scattering. 1962, the Second Vatican Council, a good work, but rejection of the prophetic message. Rejecting the 2520, the prophetic message that opened up in this history, and they rejected the message of Fatima that opened up in this history. So they're rejecting their Alpha history, the prophetic message of their Alpha history. Going into a time of scattering, we have this history of 1888, where God tried to finish the work, but the church was engulfed in civil war between the newcomers and the leadership, and they were not able to complete that process. 1989, same thing. Civil war between the Jesuits, who were seen as being here a long time, but as essentially outsiders in the Vatican and the leadership, John Paul II and his conservative allies. We placed the writing of a pamphlet attacking the message of Wagner, the writing of a book attacking the Jesuit order for betraying the Catholic Church. So when we discuss 1989 and John Paul II, we're looking at the direct counterfeit of our 1888 history. Does that make sense? So do we have any questions on what we've done so far? Questions or something to add? Yes, brother.
An observation, like a question, like when you come to 1863, you have just mentioned that they reject a message, the 2520. So I was trying to see, like, at a basic level, you can understand the 2520 to be a message of scattering, a symbol of scattering and gathering. And when you come to 1962, they reject the message of Fatima. And you equate to the message of Fatima to be like the 2520, like it was also a message of scattering and gathering. That they could have accepted it, they could have been on a gathering, but they reject the message that could have helped them to go into a gathering by destroying the king of the south.
So for the camera, the point our brother is making is that the rejection of the prophetic message is the 2520, which directly relates to the scattering and the gathering. And when we come to the counterfeit of that, when they rejected the prophetic message, it's the message of Fatima, particularly the second of the three secrets that ordered the defeat of the king of the south, which would have brought them out of a scattering time period. It would have gathered the Catholic Church. So that was also a message of scattering and gathering. That sums up your point. So if we're content with this history, I want to put it to one side for the moment and discuss the Amiga history. Any other thoughts on this so far? I'd like to keep that up for board space, but we just can't do that. So I'll erase it for now. I want to remind us of a subject that we looked at yesterday. We talked about the Sunday law when we go to work. This is the true. We go to the work at the Sunday law, yes? So when it comes to the counterfeit, when do they go to work? When's the resurrection, the healing of the deadly wound? We mark that at the Sunday law. So we mark the healing of the deadly wound, and when the papacy goes to work at the Sunday law, we're all okay with that. We recognize that when God's people go to work, when his church goes to work, we have at least a 30-year history prior to that of him preparing his church to do that work. Yes, makes sense. 1989 to the Sunday law. So when it comes to the counterfeit, all that we have without constructing these lines is healing of the deadly wound, Sunday law. If there's more to this, if there's a whole history of preparation for the true, there must be a whole preparation for the counterfeit. Does that make sense? So what we're wanting to understand is the preparation of the counterfeit of the papacy to do a work from Sunday law. Is that okay? So I want to come back. I know that we have in previous, not here, but in other places, we have looked at the Amiga history of the counterfeit. We understand that the Amiga history, I just want to This is 1863. God's people go into a scattering time. For how many years? For 126 years. And within this time period, we have the history of 1888. And prior to 1863, we have our whole Alpha history, the Millerites. Does that make sense? So just condensing all of that down to our Alpha history, Millerites, history of scattering, 126 years of scattering, in the midst of which is 1888, and then we come to the time of the end. At the time of the end, who do we see? Elder Jeff. So when we do this study of histories of failure and history of success, we use which reform lines? Ancient and modern. What are the two ancient reform lines? Moses and Christ. When do you want to start his reform line? Whose birth? Christ. He's the second angel. And this is the time of the end. So it's 4 BC, and you want to mark John or Christ? You want to mark John and then Christ? When do you want to mark Christ? Remove John, put Christ. So where's the first angel? You don't want to put him here. Why? Anyone else? Your sister. Who do you want to put here? You want to put both? Is that okay? Anyone else? We have both leaders of this history, of the Omega history, and when do they both arrive? At the time of the end. When do you first start seeing Christ visibly? When does he draw everyone's attention? People know he exists, but when is their attention drawn to him? Sister? Sorry? 27? What do you want to call that? What happens? Baptism. So this is when you see him. You see the second angel. When does he go to work? If we were to do their first fractal, it's 5 primary waymarks. This middle waymark is the transition point where John stops leading and Christ starts leading. Does that make sense? So they both are there at the time of the end. But Christ, he's working as a carpenter. He's not doing any work. Can we see that? The work is done by John in this history. This is the history of the first angel. Christ arrives on the scene at his baptism. Here you recognize him. He's visible. But does he begin his work here? After baptism? No, he begins here. I'll just call it the first temple cleansing. So this is going to become an important model for our counterfeit. I just want us to see that. Modern history. We have two reform lines. The first, Millerites, Alpha history. Then we come to our Omega. When is the time of the end? 1989. Who do we have both marked, already said it, at the time of the end? The first angel. We also have the second leader, Elder Parminder becoming an Adventist in 1989. So did he receive an increase of knowledge? So we mark both leaders at the time of the end in the end of ancient Israel, and both leaders at the time of the end in the end of modern Israel. Does that make sense? Both existing, Christ and John, both coming into being born in 4 BC. Parminder and Jeff both in 1989. But is Elder Parminder active? No. When does he become active? When does he go to work? He's going to have an increase of knowledge here on the 2520, but he's not going to work yet. He's not the second leader. When does that happen? You see him in this history, presenting 2520, time setting, but in 2014, there is a transfer of leadership from Elder Jeff to Elder Parminder. Does that make sense? Any questions or thoughts on that? Does everyone agree with that model? History of failure, history of success. To primarily understand a history of success, our own history, our number one source should be the end of ancient Israel, a history of success. And when we compare and contrast those two histories, we find them most closely aligned with our own. We can see that when we start breaking it down into fractals really neatly. Disciples, back to the Church of Pentecost, Gentiles. It has all the same feel as our own. So when we come to the time of the end in a history of success, you see both leaders at this point in time. So at 1989, when we draw this up, you can see the first angel, Elder Jeff, but Elder Parminder is there. It's Jeff that has the attention. 1989, 9/11. What do we mark internally at 9/11? Try and go back in your minds. I don't think these studies have been presented in quite a long time. But what have we associated with 9/11 internally? Not looking to external events. When studies are taken and applied to 9/11, past histories, biblical histories. My brother. Spiritualism? Okay. Sorry? I couldn't. Baptized? Sorry? Tarrying time? Yep. Tarrying time? It's a good one. Sorry? The arrival of the second angel? So this is the baptism. Someone said baptism. Just reminding us of this history. It's the arrival of the second angel, but is the second angel going to work? No. It's not going to work. Not until that empowerment do we mark the change in leadership from the first to the second. Anything else? Anything from the Old Testament relating to conference church structure? My brother. Sorry, you're going to have to repeat. So the old leadership is bypassed at 9/11. What's an Old Testament story that tells us of that? The history of Saul and David. That was the history I was trying to take us to. Do we know or remember those studies? We take one example, the history of Saul and David, and see the death of the leadership here. We all okay with that? My brother.
Mine is a question. On the line we see 1989. So was that a commander in the movement?
There was Elder Jeff in the movement?
This is my question.
Was William Miller in the Millerite movement? William Miller hadn't even become a deist yet. He was years off becoming a Protestant. I don't think Elder Jeff would have recognised a movement in 1989. So he wouldn't say that he was part of the movement in 1989, unless we start looking prophetically and not literally. And he had that knowledge within Adventism, just as William Miller had his increase of knowledge within Protestantism. Neither are trying to set up a new organisation. So I don't think at this point in time they would have disassociated themselves. From 1798 through most of that Millerite history, Miller is only trying to give a message to Protestantism. He's not trying to form any new organisation. And he's strong about that. In the end, he's forced to. But certainly at the beginning, there is no visible organisation set up. We know that God is building the church triumphant, but there is no visible organisation to join.
But on the contact of time of the MEC, the time of the was being produced by the payment, he's having a knowledge about the new dispensation which is to come, which is the new line of the priest. So when we are doing the history of David and Saul, it is right, and that's why I was asking the question that was that our man in the movement, or it was like you said it before, this is the time to join the Adventists. Am I wrong? So I want to understand.
Elder Jeff is just part of Adventism for all of this history. He's not setting up intentionally any separate organisation or movement to the conference structure. He's just sharing his truths to Adventism and beginning to attract hostility, rejection of leadership, but he's still just sharing a message within Adventism.
So were they doing that the same way as the
What do you mean? Do you mean was Elder Paminda teaching in that history?
Okay. What I want to mean is not repetition, but when we are seeing two people in that history, we will see them later associate or maybe setting up something together. Yeah.
When you come to the baptism, had John even met Christ? They'd never met before here. paths don't cross until here. So I don't think they necessarily have to be working together in this history. But they're still on the same track. Is that okay? So 9/11, I want to go back to what our brother had, the story he had given us about Saul and death of leadership. We're all okay with that. There are old studies showing from different histories, different lines, this. I know the bypassing is progressive, but particularly marking here, bypassing of Adventist leadership, symbolised by the death of Saul in the instance given. We're all okay with that. So after the death of the leadership, we're marking this as 9/11 and the arrival of the second angel, symbolised by Christ. He goes into the wilderness. He comes out again in 2014, second leader, and we see a transition here from Elder Jeff to Elder Parminder. The empowerment of the second angel. So as we see the empowerment of the second angel, there's a change in leadership. And why is the first leader bypassed? If I can use that phrase. Why is there a transition from Elder Jeff to Elder Parminder? Or if you want a hint, why is there a transition from Moses to Joshua? My brother. Sorry? Moses struck a rock. What application are you making? Jeff rejected the message of this history. 2012, rejected the formalised message of that dispensation. 2014, a transition between leaders. Then we come to 2019, and we can mark this dispensation. Bookend it, you could say. It's a progressive history. And we come to our second Advent, Panium. So we're all okay with that so far. So then we want to construct the counterfeit. And I'm fully aware I don't have my notes as I would like them to do this. So it won't be the last time that we do it if I can get my notes in order. Really just trying to find the sources. We've already looked at this history. We identified their Alpha history, 1899 to 1945, the history of World War I and World War II. Then we looked at 1950. Go into a scattering in 1962. And then we placed 1989, that attempt of John Paul II while at war with the Jesuits to complete the work, and identified them in a scattering period over this time period until their time is the end. And then we need to see this reform line replicated. Now, this could be less interactive and a whole lot of reading, but I'm hoping you see the sense in what I'm suggesting. And also, if you know this history as well, can add to it. But it won't be a complete study because I don't have all of the sources that I wanted to find. In the previous studies done throughout this year, we've spoken about this date, and what did we place it as? The time of the end for the papacy, for modern Babylon. Has anyone seen those studies? What date did we place that as? We placed it as 2001. Do you know why we did that, my brother? Do you know why we placed 2001?
Yes. Because the Sengalian mafia, so they go to it. So after them seeing him, they started training him. So that's where we mark the time. Because they see their leader, at that same time, Paul is also looking for the person to replace him.
So our brother has spoken of the St. Galen Mafia. Do we all know who the St. Galen Mafia are? People were unhappy with the leadership of John Paul II. Those people being primarily liberals and primarily Jesuits. So after 1989 and the failure of that history, the St. Galen Mafia is a group of liberal cardinals who come together in top secret in the town of St. Galen to try and plan how at the next conclave, when John Paul dies, they can replace him with a progressive liberal pope. John Paul II, he's working intimately with a prominent Catholic theologian. They're working like this. There's John Paul II and there is his theologian. Who was his theologian? If you were to look in the search engine for Google Scholar, it's a record of all academic publications. You will find that the most prolific chief theologian the Catholic Church has had in the last century, the last 100 years, is Ratzinger. He is the theologian for the Catholic Church. We don't realize how prolific he was or his role. He isn't a priest or a cardinal who was known for his speaking or his eloquence or his people skills. What made him powerful and famous was his theological studies. If you were to type his name, Joseph Ratzinger, into Google Scholar search engine, which records academic publications, in 4 seconds you would have 24,600 hits for his articles. If you typed in Benedict XVI, you would receive 66,000, over 66,000 hits for his publications. The only other theologian in the last 100 years can double that number. It's not a Catholic. The only Catholic theologian who comes close to him will get about 40,000 hits. But Catholic or non-Catholic, he comes in as the second most prolific theologian of the last 100 years, and of Catholics, the chief theologian. And that's what he was known for. He was rewriting codifying the beliefs of the Catholic Church, trying to bring them out of a mess. And he began this well before 1989. He began this in 1950s. And that was all he loved to do, was to read and write theological studies. In this history, there's a crisis in the Catholic Church. It's described as the most serious crisis the Catholic Church has faced since the Protestant Reformation. What is that crisis? As far as crises the Catholic Church has ever faced, they don't mark 1798, they say Protestant Reformation, this. What is the this? Sister Solange. Sorry? Scandals? I'm quoting here from an article by Foreign Affairs. The Catholic Church is facing its most serious crisis in 500 years, and they're talking about the sexual abuse crisis within the Catholic Church. Are we all familiar with that? Many Catholic scholars call it the most serious crisis for the last half millennium. In these last few months, A new wave of abuse revelations has left the world in shock. It's just been shock after shock for many years now. It's on such a level, they give the statistics for only one US state, just the state of Pennsylvania. Just one state, the state of Pennsylvania, the report documented 1,000 children abused by 300 priests. So if you can times that by the states of America, and then times that by Europe, South America, Australia, the entire world, the scale of this crisis, the magnitude. Tens and tens of thousands of children abused, thousands of priests guilty of it. So this is what they describe as the most serious crisis in 500 years, and the Catholic Church has had to pay out billions in compensation to the victims. We're all somewhat familiar with that. You might not know it in detail, but I'm sure you've all seen that in the news and documented. So this scandal starts hitting the Catholic Church, primarily coming out into the open in the 1980s. Prior to that, it's fairly, you don't find much documented. Everything was more secret. In the 1980s, this material starts to be leaked out. In the 1990s, 1992, the Catholic territories in the United States, by 1992, had already paid out $400 million to victims in these cases. But in all of these cases, in almost all of these cases, when the victims were identified and that money was paid out, the documents were sealed, all the information was sealed about the cases, and the victims had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Do we understand what a non-disclosure agreement means? So if someone was abused and they received compensation for that, they would have to sign a form saying that they would never speak about this publicly. They would keep all of that abuse secret. So through the history of the 1980s, 1990s, even while they're paying out hundreds of millions of dollars in America alone, everything is being kept secret. And yet it escalated. In 2001, here we've marked before Francis. Francis is made a cardinal. He meets the St. Galen group. They decide that he's their liberal option for the papacy. So you can mark him being noted in 2001. But as we said before, who must the first angel be? Benedict. I want to use their original names. It's neither of them a pope here. Ratzinger becomes Benedict. Bergoglio becomes Francis. So throughout this history of the close working relationship between Ratzinger and John Paul II, John Paul II was training up Ratzinger with the plan that Ratzinger would succeed him. Everyone knew that John Paul wanted Ratzinger to be the next pope. He was prepping him for that office because they both had a conservative mindset. They were much of the same frame of mind. In 2001, does anyone know what Ratzinger was in charge of? It happened before 2001. I think you know what it was originally called. I see smiles. What's it called now? What was it called before? They changed the name. What was the original name? Elder Manjit. The Office of the Inquisition. So if it had have been a couple of hundred years ago, Ratzinger would have been head of the Inquisition. But the Inquisition had a bit of a stigma, dirty name attached to it, so they changed its name. And what did they change its name to? Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So I'll write that down so we can remember it. of or for? Congregation for the doctrine of the faith. And this was a role made for Ratzinger because he was a theologian. It's his work to tell people what the rules are and are not. As he was as theologian and head for the congregation of the doctrine of the faith, Benedict gained the not so flattering nickname. Does anyone know what his nickname was? God's Rottweiler. So can you imagine how he did? He was known for dragging liberal cardinals and priests into his office who were not towing the theological line and immediately defrocking them, to have a short little interview and then just kick them out of the Catholic Church. He became known as God's Rottweiler. So he was quite aggressive in his tactics. He had a rigid interpretation of doctrine and a stringent enforcement of church rules. But in 2001, he goes to John Paul II and he asks himself for a particular task. He asks that all of these sexual abuse scandals come under the authority of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So he wants to take personal charge of cleaning up the Catholic Church from these scandals. So in 2001, Ratzinger takes oversight of the sexual abuse scandal. He immediately very quickly sends out a letter to all the Catholic leaders, all the cardinals across the world. And in that letter, he tells them that they are to report all of the sexual abuse cases to the Catholic Church, but they are forbidden to report anything to the government or to the police. Everything must be kept secret and in-house. And if they do report abuse cases to the law enforcement agencies, he says that they will be excommunicated. So he takes charge of the sexual abuse scandal, but he also covers everything up in this, and it was law by then that everything had to be dealt with in-house in the Catholic Church in secrecy. No government, if there was sexual abuse cases in a Catholic school here in Uganda, the priests, it's illegal for them under the Catholic Church rules to report that abuse to the police in Uganda. And if they do, Ratzinger would have had them excommunicated. He had to only report it to his Catholic superiors, which is why then you had thousands of cases where nothing was done. But he does begin to clean up this crisis. So just as way of revision, Ratzinger, for about 50 years by now, has been, I think he's over 90 now, 2020, he's over 90 years old. He had been the chief theologian for the Catholic Church. He becomes head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the successor of the Inquisition. He's known as God's Rottweiler. But in 2001, he goes to John Paul II and asks to be given oversight of the greatest scandal the Catholic Church has faced in 500 years. And he starts to try and cleanse the Catholic Church. And he makes a statement in this history quoting him. He said in this history, in one particular sermon, I suppose you would call it, that he makes, he says it like a prayer. He said, "Lord, your church seems like a boat about to sink," referring to the Catholic Church, "a boat taking in water on every side." He says, "There is filth in the Catholic Church. The soiled garments and face of your church throw us into confusion. Yet it is we ourselves who have soiled them. It is we who betray you time and time again. Have mercy on your church even within her. Adam continues to fall again and again." So he begins to speak publicly about the internal state of the Catholic Church, and he describes it as filth. And he says that filth is not something that has been thrown upon them from the outside, but it is what they have themselves done on the inside. So he begins in 2001 the work of trying to clean up the internal filth of the Catholic Church. Just quoting, in 2001, Ratzinger acted to give his office, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, jurisdiction over all sexual abuse cases worldwide. And soon he began to push for particularly one investigation that was quite high profile, despite opposition from the Vatican leadership themselves. So against Vatican leaders, he's beginning to investigate high-profile cases. After ascending the throne of St. Peter, he became the first pope to kick predator priests out of the church. In 2001 and 2012, the last 2 full years of his papacy, the church defrocked 384 sexually abusing priests. 384, and he became the first pope to do that. So he's working against considerable opposition from the leadership when he takes over these cases in 2001, and he continues to do that work until 2005. And what happens in 2005? John Paul. How did John Paul handle the sexual abuse cases? How did he deal with the filth inside the church? He didn't. He did nothing. He failed on that score. So John Paul II has done nothing. Ratzinger from 2001 begins to clean up what he describes as internal filth. 2005, you have the death of leadership. The death of John Paul II. And we marked here the baptism of Christ. So you see how many here? You see John at the baptism, but it's also the arrival of the second, yes? So you also have the arrival of the second. Is Christ now visibly seen? Hasn't been seen in this history, now he begins to be visibly recognized. Can we see that? So in 2005, John Paul II dies. They meet at that conclave, and the relevant cardinals begin to vote on John Paul's successor. Who were their 2 options? It was a tight race between Ratzinger and Bergoglio. Here he's recognized. He comes to that conclave. The St. Galen's Mafia, which formed in 1996, they launched into action here to try and get him elected. They try and get him over Ratzinger. Do they succeed? No. Ratzinger becomes Pope Benedict. So you have the overthrowing of the old leadership, the death of the old leadership, and marking the new leadership. Here it's under the first angel, under Benedict or Ratzinger. At the same time, you see the arrival of the second angel. Christ begins to be recognized. Bergoglio begins to be recognized, but Christ doesn't begin work yet. It wasn't the time for him to do that. Bergoglio also, he does not win this conclave. He does not yet begin work. That's going to happen in 2013. We'll go back to 2012. 2012, Benedict asks for a report. Benedict asks for a report on the internal state of the Vatican, and he's given a 300-page report with a red binder. And through these 300 pages, what is described in this internal state of the Vatican is a condition of immorality that I think any of us would find shocking, even knowing their practices. Homosexuality, rampant homosexuality between the priests. They would keep male consorts. Orgies, just as you would expect them. All of those things. This is an article from The Atlantic. It says the real reason Pope Benedict resigned lies in a 300-page Vatican dossier that allegedly found an underground network of high-ranking gay clergy, complete with sex parties and shady dealings with the Vatican Bank. So it was also fraud, corporate fraud. Pope Benedict XVI says he's resigning because of old age, but the major Italian newspaper, La Repubblica, wrote an article demonstrating the real cause of his resignation. He didn't want to deal with the repercussions of a secret 300-page dossier that found an underground network of high-ranking gay clergy complete with orgies and shady dealings with the already scandal-ridden Vatican Bank. The Vatican Bank is known to be a hotbed of extortion. The dossier comes in 2 volumes, 2 folders hardbound in red, with the header Pontifical Secret. The paper said the Pope had taken the decision on December 17 that he was going to resign, the day he received the dossier compiled by 3 cardinals delegated to look into the so-called VatiLeaks affair. So there's a scandal in 2012 known as VatiLeaks, where confidential documents detailing the level of corruption, both financial and sexual, within the Catholic Church, and those confidential documents are taken by, I think it's the Pope's butler, one of his assistants, and they're leaked to the press. It's the largest information leak the Catholic Church has ever had, and this created a huge scandal. Pope Benedict asked for an investigation, and he tasked 3 prominent cardinals who were independent to that Vatican hierarchy with investigating it. And they came out with this 300-page dossier. And according to the Italian newspaper, the day that he received that document was the day he decided to resign, 17th of December 2012. The dossier alleges that a gay lobby exists within the Church and has some sort of control on the careers of those in the Vatican. The group is not as covert as it thinks and has been subject to blackmail by people on the outside. In response to this, the Vatican released a statement saying, by the Vatican spokesperson, saying neither the Cardinals Commission nor I will make comments to confirm or deny the things that this newspaper said. Let each one assume his or own responsibility. So at the release of this report and the newspaper article alleging the cause of Pope Benedict's resignation, the Vatican spokesperson said he would neither confirm it nor deny it. So they refused to deny the allegations. So 2012, there's a scandal. It shows the failure of Benedict to actually reform the Catholic Church, particularly at the Vatican, and also the financial corruption. And he decides to resign. In 2013, you have the end of Benedict and the introduction of Francis. Now, in this 2013 conclave, we're out of time, so I will close, but just to give some history. At this 2013 conclave, they come together to vote, and the vote looks like this. There was 5 leading. There was many that received votes, but there was 5 leading. In the first vote, this man won, because they have to vote until the winner gets a certain percentage. So in the first vote, the winner was a man named Scolo. Coming in second place was Bergoglio. He received 26 votes. And then there was a man known as Ouellette. Sure, I'm not saying that correctly. Scolo 30 votes, Benedict 26 votes, Ouellette 22 votes. So these were the 3 front runners in the 2016 first vote. Scolo won that first vote, but by not a high enough percentage to win. And the problem they're facing is the internal Italian politics of the Vatican. Scolo is Italian. And when the Italians can't agree on how to vote, they have always lost the conclave. So everyone knows, because even though Scolo led, all the Italians haven't agreed or united behind him. When the Italians are not in unity, the Italian candidate does not win. So even though he got the majority on the first vote, it wasn't enough. Everyone knew it wouldn't be him. Next comes Bergoglio and Ouellette. And this, again, turned into a fight between the conservative and liberal factions within the Catholic Church. Many people saw issues with Ouellette, but he had highly influential supporters besides other Americans. The Americans liked the conservatives. They're mostly conservative Catholics. One of them was Cardinal Joachim Meissner, the Archbishop of Cologne, Germany. He'd been that Archbishop, by the way, since 1989, and for 9 years before that, Archbishop of Berlin. Widely considered the leading conservative in the German church, he was known to be very close to John Paul II and a lifelong friend of Joseph Ratzinger. He wanted to ensure that the next pope would faithfully follow the line and vision of his 2 predecessors. So there's the leading the leading conservative in the German church, Cardinal Meissner. A lifelong friend of Ratzinger, very close to John Paul II, and he's throwing his weight behind Ouellette because everyone knows Bergoglio is the liberal. And he's stated to have been that Tuesday night before the vote, standing outside the door of his room urging his fellow electors, vote for Ouellette, Bergoglio is too old. So there was a faction of conservatives fighting to not let Bergoglio into office. They recognized the ideological differences between the 2 men. But those who were still living from the old St. Galen's Mafia threw their support behind Bergoglio, and in came a liberal pope. And he then began his work of reforming the church. So we'll close now for time. I'll just do a short revision. We've laid out the reform line of the priests as we see God begin to work, gather his church, prepare his church in a way that they can do a work at the Sunday law. So you know that the counterfeit, the beast whose deadly wound is healed, must also be dealt with, prepared to do a work from the Sunday law. We've compared and contrasted the history of the true with the history of the counterfeit in the history of the end of modern Babylon. At the time of the end, in a history of success, you have both on the scene at the time of the end. You have Elder Jeff and Elder Parminder on the scene at the time of the end. Compare and contrast that. In 2001, you have Ratzinger and Bergoglio. Ratzinger is going to take over the largest crisis the Catholic Church has faced since the Reformation, and is going to begin to clean out the filth of the Catholic Church and reform it. He does that as head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. At the same time, Bergoglio is made a cardinal, and he starts to interact with other liberal leaders who wish to see him become pope. 2005, you see the death of leadership, the death of, we see that symbolically with the conference structure, through lines such as the death of Saul, arrival of David. compare and contrast, you see the death of John Paul II, the leadership. You have the first and the second angel. The first is the leader, but the second has arrived. Ratzinger is the leader, he becomes Benedict, but Bergoglio has arrived, he's visible. It's not yet going to begin work. You come to 2012 and there's a scandal that the leader cannot control. He's on the wrong side of it, he's done all he can, and he's going to step back from leadership. 2014, that leadership changed between Elder Jeff and Elder Parminder. 2013, because of the scandal of 2012 that Ratzinger was not equipped to handle, there's a transition from Benedict Ratzinger to Francis. And then in 2014, we're going to see Francis begin the work of restructuring the Catholic Church. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you for how you have given us this methodology and you've shone your light upon your people. Lord, we want it to do the internal work, not just be head knowledge. I pray that we will access the deeper meaning, that we'll understand you better by understanding how you deal with your people. I pray, Lord, that while these subjects are complicated, that we might be able to accurately trace the thread of external events. Please be with us through the remainder of our day. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen.